And they had this segment where, and Chevy Chase would come on and say, and now for those who are challenged in their hearing, this is the news for the hearing impaired. And he'd say something, and Garrett Morris would come on in a substitute, here's the news for everyone.
That'll be helpful.
It was funny.
That'll be great.
We were more easily amused back in the old days. Be sure to get your materials in. Watch for things on Blackboard. I hope to get things caught up in the next couple of days. So look for scores of things that are missing, or maybe I haven't entered the score in Blackboard. If you've already gotten it into me, let's watch for that so we get everything wrapped up for you. In Doc 2, I try to schedule some extra time so that you and I can respond to questions, because it's very often where the practical questions arise. But I want to affirm again what I've said at least twice this semester, that a good deal of what we talk about in Doc 2, we lay the foundation for in several things in Doc 1, especially with regard to the nature of original sin, the nature of God, the nature of sin being broken relationship, etc., etc. So look for the roots and the understandings of that back there. That's really where it starts, because there's only one hero in the Bible, and that's the Lord, from beginning to end. And that's really what the book of Revelation is going to show us. As you have particular questions yet or whatever, please feel free to be in touch with either me, Professor Gross, Dr. Holtorf, as you're anticipating various things of teaching. And please know you can always, once you get out in the field and you're wrestling with things, you can always contact us. And now, by the way, it's official. Pastor Coe has received the call to teach on our campus in theology and philosophy beginning next fall. I suppose that makes the teaching of philosophy on our campus the RICO Act. I can quit on that one. Today is Wednesday. On Monday, we launched into this discussion of the 7 pictures of the church, and I indicated to you that there are 7 visions that John outlined. Chapter 1 is really an introduction that sets the stage. It's almost like going to a musical when the orchestra comes out, and you get the themes that God is going to make clear all the way through, because twice you have this reference to the Trinitarian nature of God, who is totally relationship. And that's really what the book of Revelation is about, the Lord's relationship with his world, his creation, and his church from beginning to end. Another thing that's going on that I think is deceptive to people, and this really goes back to something we touched on for a couple of days, and that is the doctrine of election. Because you get this double reference to the 144,000. You have it first in chapter 7, and then you get it again in chapter 14. And a lot of people want to say, well, look, there's already part of the history of the world that's passed, because you got the 144,000 here already in heaven, and then they appear here, and all this tribulation is going on, and that's part of where this whole notion of millennialism arises, from the rapture and so forth. I think what that text is saying, and it's a word of encouragement to all of you, that when things seem the bleakest and things seem most oppositional to you, and when you wonder if God is there at all or if he has forgotten your name, you must understand that you are in the hands of your God, and you are already present before him. We looked at this in Doc 1 this morning when we looked at Ephesians, the first verses of chapter 2. And we looked at it last week in here, or 2 weeks ago, when we looked at Colossians chapter 3. It is because you and I are linked to Christ by God's promise and by his claim. Therefore, we are already in the hands of God. The rest of it has yet just to happen. And so see yourself as those who, no matter what else is going on, you're already in the hands of God. So that it becomes a matter of encouragement to be to be faithful. On Monday, we spent a good deal of time taking a look at the center of the book of Revelation, chapter 12, verse 1 to chapter 14, verse 20. I had outlined for you these series of visions. Let me kind of put a title on each of them for the sake of your notes and for the sake of your consideration. The first vision that goes from chapter 2, verse 1 to chapter 3, verse 22. That's the story of the seven churches. And where John says, and to the angel of the church of Smyrna, to the angel at the church of Pergamum, to the angel at the church of Ephesus, right. They all of those letters follow a specific pattern. That whole section, I think, that the Lord is addressing the church as it is encountered in the present time, with all of its strengths and with all of its weaknesses. And that's what I think the nature of the seven churches is kind of saying we're writing to the entire church in all of the fullnesses. Every one of those letters that John writes follows this form. A title is given to Jesus. And the church is then commended for something. And then there's a problem in the church of some sort. And then there's a challenge and or a charge. And at the end of each of them is a promise that the Savior makes to that church. And the promise that he makes is specifically tied to the problem and to his title. So that if ever you lead a Bible study on that, dig for that kind of understanding. You can find that in a really solid Bible dictionary. Use your imagination, because you go to a solid Bible dictionary like Interpreter's Dictionary of the Bible, which is huge. It's about 5 volumes. And you start digging into the history and the culture and the situation in some of these churches, and then go back and just keep going back and forth between the letter and the nature of that place. And there are connections that start jumping out, in which, in their setting, the Savior is identifying himself also as the Savior in that setting and is making promises. So we find ourselves wandering through all 7 of those kinds of circumstances. I think that's the point of the first vision, that the church is in its present historical situation, facing strengths and weaknesses. I think then there's a brief hiatus in chapter 4, those 11 verses, kind of a parallel to the introduction in chapter 1. But the second vision really opens in chapter 5, verse 1, and it goes all the way through chapter 8, verse 1. And there's an emphasis on 7 again. In the same way there were 7 churches, here there's the opening of 7 seals. Now when these seals are opened, and I know how you folks are into caring for the environment. We're not talking animals from Antarctica here. We are instead talking the wax thing that would seal up a scroll and keep anybody from opening it unless you were authorized to open it. And that's the question that goes up. Who is worthy to open this? The sealed scroll means the will of God, which is to be made known as the Lord unfolds it, or quite literally, if you will, unrolls it. And it's because the Lamb is worthy to do it. I think the parallel that's here is the Lamb being worthy to to open the seal and unroll the scroll. It's the same as what St. Paul says in Corinthians when he says God has made him, Christ, to be our wisdom. That if you want the key to how the Lord is operating in history, you must look at Christ. That he is gift, related to the Father, blessed, given, lives in faith and trust, and then the Father's devastation, and then his resurrection. That's the way the Lord operates in history. And I think that's what we find in this whole second vision. That the Lord's will gets worked out in history. It becomes obvious in chapter 6, verses 9 through 11, that the church is in distress. Because in chapter 6, verses 9 through 11, you have the souls of those who have been martyred for the word of God. They're under the throne, and they cry out, "O sovereign Lord, holy and true, how long will it be before you avenge our lives on the earth?" And they're given a white robe, and they're told to rest a little longer. So the church is comforted in the face of the fact that it is distressed. But in chapter 7, verses 4 through 12, you also get the reminder that the church is in the hand of God. That's where the first time you get that whole notion of the 144,000. Now this builds to the opening of the seventh seal, which is in reference to that movie that I alluded to on Monday or maybe last week. And part of what you find in this vision here that moves to the third vision, you get this kind of notion that you cannot just line these events up and identify them with particular things in history. Although the things in history, you will feel like that's what you're going through. Let's give an example. Go to chapter 6. Chapter 6, verse 3. He opened the second seal. I heard the second living creature say, "Come." And out came another horse, bright red. Its rider was permitted to take peace from the earth, so that men should slay one another. He was given a great sword. The upheaval of war that goes on, and civil unrest. Third seal. I heard the living creature say, "Come." And I saw and behold a black horse, and its rider had a balance in his hand. And I heard what seemed to be a voice in the midst of the four living creatures say, "A quart of wheat for a denarius, and 3 quarts of barley for a denarius." What this is talking about is poverty among the masses. Because to work a day's wage, denarius, and get 1 quart of wheat, that's enough to keep one person alive. If you're also going to try to feed your family, you got to buy barley instead, but barley is nowhere near as nourishing and helpful. It's a rougher grain, and so the poor end up getting crushed in the middle of these judgments. But it says, "Do not harm the oil and the wine." Who are the people who can afford the oil and the wine? The rich. So this kind of pattern of God's judgment goes on all the time. That the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. Seems to happen on a regular basis. And then the Lord devastates and rearranges the whole thing. Verse 8, I saw and behold a pale horse. This is the fourth seal, and its rider's name was Death, and Hades followed it. They're given power over a fourth of the earth to kill with a sword and famine and pestilence, and by wild beasts of the earth. Here there is no sense of security. You know, now, is this a reference to the bubonic plague that spread through Europe? Yeah. Is this a reference to Zika? Yeah. Is this a reference to AIDS? Yeah. All the above. Okay. Let's go then to chapter 8, verse 1, where the seventh seal is open, and there is silence in heaven for about half an hour. This I understand, because 2 weeks ago we were trying to be in touch with the federal government and the Social Security system to change my mother-in-law's mailing address for her Social Security card, and we got an answer in Washington at the federal government, and then there was silence in heaven for about half an hour. Pray the pale rider upon them. seventh seal is open, all of a sudden there's 7 angels and 7 trumpets, and all of a sudden you got this, it gets just bigger and bigger and bigger all within it. And now you've got all of this judgment coming up even more. In this particular one, in this third vision, the Lord smites nature itself. It is not just the economy and politics and civil society like you have in the second vision. In the third vision, there is devastation on the natural order itself. Let's take a couple of examples of that. 7. First angel blew his trumpet, there followed hail and fire mixed with blood, which fell on the earth. The reference to a third of the earth and a third of the trees is that the Lord limits. That's what that means. In the same way that 3.5 is a limit by that. Verse 8, second trumpet is blown, and something like a great mountain burning with fire was thrown into the sea. And the third of the sea became blood. The third of the living creatures in the sea died, and the third of the ships were destroyed. You see, this is all has to do with the natural order. So that even that is not. Here, please recall Revelation chapter 8, where it says the whole creation groans in travail, waiting for the adoption of the sons of God. So, do we as Christians, because of our belief in the first article and our praying of the fourth petition, do you and I attend to our care for the creation in a considerate way? Are we alert to matters of economy? Absolutely. This is the Lord's creation. We do not irresponsibly use it just for ourselves. In the same breath, when a lot of this devastation happens as a result of what we do, the numbers of us who are living life these days, as well as for all of the good that we have gotten out of advanced technology and science, in the same breath we brought the judgment of Lord down upon us at the same time. And we don't escape that by suddenly running off into the woods with Ralph Waldo Emerson and, living by Walden Pond. That's not it. But when we see this, we recognize it's the devastation of human greed that's going on, that's inattentive to things. Or that there's so many of us, how are we going to do it? So it's not just one or the other, it's a both and. We have the care of God, and at the same time, we bring it down on ourselves. By the way, those things, go back to chapter 8, verse 7. Angel blows his trumpet, there's hail and fire falling on the earth. Verse 8, second angel blows his trumpet, a great mountain burning with fire thrown into the sea. A third of the sea became blood. Fourth angel, verse 12, fourth angel blew his trumpet, a third of the sun was struck, and a third of the moon, and a third of the stars, so that a third of their light was darkened. Okay? Look at chapter 9, verse 3. The bottomless pit is opened up, and from the smoke came locusts on the earth. They were given the power of scorpions on the earth. Do these sound familiar? In what way, Chris? How do they sound familiar? And I see you saying, yeah, this sounds familiar. Yeah. Oh, is that Joel?
10 plagues.
Yeah, these are the same as the 10 plagues on Egypt. That gets layered into this thing. Okay? Now, let's go to the seventh angel in the middle of all of this. In chapter 10. Another mighty angel coming down from heaven, wrapped in a cloud with a rainbow over his head. this reflects all of the earlier stuff in chapter 4 especially. It talks about the majesty of heaven. So these angels become not only announcers of what God is doing, but also ones who effect or cause these things to take place. One of you was, I was reading the essay of one of you the other night, or your article review, and you were wondering whether or not Lutherans believe we have guardian angels. Yes, you do. Yes, you do. You have angels that watch over you constantly. Rest confident of that. Since then, I've seen how some of you drive. Your angels are working overtime.
A lot of people say, like, when a family member dies, they're my guardian angel or something like that. That's what I was gonna just make sure that was.
No. Your guardian angels, any of you ever watched Star Trek? I mean the old original Star Trek. There was this one episode where they encountered these beings that are so, in the science fiction, they are so far beyond the development of the human race that they have these beings that are sheer light, and they overwhelming in their power and whatnot. When I try to describe what angels are about, that's what it's like. The other one who has caught it, I think, in literature is C.S. Lewis when he describes the angelic beings in his space trilogy, especially in chapters late in the third of that trilogy, That Hideous Strength, because these angelic beings visit Professor Ransom in his dwelling after, and don't be frightened. You have guardian angels, and they're not fat little boys in diapers. Okay, they are winged dragons.
So then, I've heard both ways on this. Do people look down on us from heaven? Like our loved ones, do they look down?
That'd be kind of comforting, wouldn't it? Like Thanksgiving after
I don't know.
Grandma
if it would
has
be so
died.
I don't know. I've always been curious because I've heard like a lot of people take comfort in that, but I don't know if that's necessarily a theological thing that it says somewhere.
I don't think it is. Because then Grandma could see you shoplifting too. I don't think that's Grandma's idea of heaven. Grandma then also hears you when you lose your temper and swear. Okay? In case of my grandmother, it serves me right. She taught those words to me. My grandfather did that. Okay. My grandfather was very cool. He was well into his 90s and he was still driving. He had this huge Buick Electra that had a V8 engine in it. He'd sit behind this thing and we'd be driving on the interstate from Indianapolis up to Fort Wayne. And he'd come up behind somebody and they were doing the speed limit. And my grandfather would get impatient. He wouldn't say much. He'd just say, "Shit or get off the pot." And all of a sudden, he wouldn't even check his rear view mirrors. He'd just whip into the left lane and floor the gas pedal. And we'd be sitting in the back going, "Whoo!" Ignition, Houston. Boom! All the time, my grandfather would just be. He was a very cool dude. My grandfather was not a big man. He was really rather short. But he had worked outside all his life. He had some of the strongest hands because he would pick and shuck corn by hand for years. All of that. My grandfather just, so he'd come over on Sunday and you sit down on the couch next to him, and sit down and say, Grandpa, how you doing? And he'd put his hand right here on your leg and start to squeeze. How are you, Dirk? Hey, Grandpa! That's why all of us grandkids, when his casket went by, we opened the sink, we squeezed his knee. How you doing, Grandpa? Chapter 15, verse 1. Chapter 15, verse 1. Through chapter 16, verse 21 is where the 7 bowls then finally get poured out on the earth, on the nations of the earth. And here it becomes complete and entire. There's not a limitation. Take a look, for example, at chapter 16, verse 3. The second angel poured his bowl into the sea, and it became like the blood of a dead man. And every living thing died that was in the sea. This is no longer provisional. We're moving to the end. You see the comparison? That's just an example. What you get in chapter 17, beginning at verse 1 through chapter 19, verse 10, is God's judgment, not on the kingdoms of the earth, but on everything that pretended to be the church. He is especially upset with that. And so you have the judgment of the whore of Babylon here that presented itself as the true church. And that's why you have this lament in chapter 18 that begins in verse 2. Fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great. It has become a dwelling place of demons. Okay? That reflects all this language out of the Old Testament prophets that talk about this thing. And then ultimately it comes to chapter 19, verse 11, because then the judgment itself finally falls. I saw heaven, this is the 7th vision, I saw heaven open, and behold a white horse. He who sat upon it is called Faithful and True, and in righteousness he judges and makes war. This one is, whereas the rider of the white horse back in the earlier one tends to be almost a demonic figure, an antichrist. This one is obviously the Christ himself, by all of the language that's used to describe him and by all the action that takes place. Because of the invitation then in verse 17, an angel standing in the sun with a loud voice called to all the birds, come, gather for the great supper of God, to eat the flesh of kings, the flesh of captains, the flesh of mighty men. The judgment is fallen. Chapter 20 then is the closing of heaven itself and the advent of the new kingdom that begins in verse 11. I saw a great white throne, and him who sat upon it. From his presence earth and sky fled away. No place was found for them. I saw the dead, great and small, standing before the throne, and books were opened. Also another book was opened, which is the book of life. And the dead were judged by what was written in the books, by what they had done, and the sea gave up the dead in it. Death and Hades gave up the dead in them, and all were judged. And then comes the end. Chapter 21, I saw a new heaven and a new earth. For the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and the sea was no more. I saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, behold, the dwelling of God is with men. We're back in Eden. We're back in Eden. And it's when that happens, verse 4, he will wipe away every tear from their eyes. Death shall be no more, neither shall there be mourning, nor crying, nor pain anymore. for the former things have passed away. Look at chapter 22, verse 1. He showed me the river of the water of life, bright as crystal, flowing from the throne of God. This is a theme all the way through the scriptures, because there was a river in the Garden of Eden, and it flowed out, and the tree of life was next to it. And when Ezekiel is given the vision of the restored temple, there's a river that flows out from the Holy of Holies from under the door. When it talks about the church in Psalm 46, it says there is a stream, there is a stream, the waters whereof make glad the city of God, the holy place of his tabernacle. In a word, a river runs through it. And if you don't know that movie or book, you need to watch it, because that's the point of this thing. It's going to be my fondest ambition and hope that you and I will be together there. It's been a privilege and an honor to try to share some glimpse and piece of that in my own weak and fumbling way. I've grown to the habit of closing this class with a reading that I think catches this probably better than any other that I know how to do. I got your attention. About half an hour later, or it might have been 100 years later, for time there is not like time here, Lucy stood with her dear friend, her oldest Narnian friend, the fawn Tumnus, looking down over the wall of that garden and seeing all Narnia spread out below. But when you looked down, you found that this hill was much higher than you had thought. It sank down with shining cliffs thousands of feet below them, and trees in that lower world looked no bigger than grains of green salt. Then she turned inward again and stood with her back to the wall and looked at the garden. I see, she said at last thoughtfully. I see now. This garden is like the stable. It is far bigger inside than it was outside. Of course, daughter of Eve, said the fawn. The further up and the further in you go, the bigger everything gets. The inside is larger than the outside. Lucy looked hard at the garden and saw that it was not really a garden at all, but a whole world with its own rivers and woods and sea and mountains, but they were not strange. She knew them all. I see, she said. This is still Narnia, and more real and more beautiful than the Narnia down below, just as it was more real and more beautiful than the Narnia outside the stable door. I see world within world, Narnia within Narnia. Yes, said Mr. Tumnus, like an onion. Except that as you continue to go in and in, each circle is larger than the last. And Lucy looked this way and that and soon found that a new and beautiful thing had happened to her. Whatever she looked at, however far away it might be, once she had fixed her eyes steadily on it, became quite clear and close as if she were looking through a telescope. She could see the whole southern desert and beyond it the great city of Tashbaan. To eastward she could see Cair Paravel on the edge of the sea and the very window of the room that had once been her own. And far out to sea she could discover the islands. Island after island to the end of the world, and beyond the end the huge mountain which they had called Aslan's country. But now she saw that it was part of a great chain of mountains which ringed around the whole world. In front of her it seemed to come quite close. Then she looked at her left and saw that what she took to be a great bank of brightly colored cloud cut off from them by a gap. But she looked harder and saw that it was not a cloud at all, but a real land. And when she had fixed her eyes on one particular spot of it, she at once cried out, Peter, Edmund, come and look, come quickly. And they came and looked, for their eyes also had become like hers. Why, exclaimed Peter, it's England, and that's the house itself. Professor Kirk's old home in the country, where all our adventures began. I thought that house had been destroyed, said Edmund. So it was, said the fawn. But you are now looking at the England within England, the real England, just as this is the real Narnia. and in that inner England no good thing is destroyed. Suddenly they shifted their eyes to another spot, and then Peter and Edmund and Lucy gasped with amazement and shouted out and began waving, for there they saw their own father and mother waving back at them across the great deep valley. It was like when you see people waving at you from the deck of a big ship when you're waiting on the quay to meet them. How can we get at them, said Lucy. That is easy, said Mr. Tumnus. That country and this country, all real countries, are only spurs jutting out from the great mountains of Aslan. We have only to walk along the ridge upward and inward till it joins on. And listen, there is King Frank's horn. We must all go up. And soon they found themselves all walking together. And a great bright procession it was, up towards the mountains, higher than you could see in this world, even if they were there to be seen. But there was no snow on those mountains. There were forests and green slopes and sweet orchards and flashing waterfalls, one above the other going up forever. And the land they were walking on grew narrower all the time, with a deep valley on each side. And across that valley, the land which was the real England grew nearer and nearer. The light ahead was growing stronger. Lucy saw that the great series of many-colored cliffs led up in front of them like a giant staircase, and then she forgot everything else, because Aslan himself was coming leaping down from cliff to cliff like a living cataract of power and beauty. The very first person whom Aslan called to him was Puzzle the donkey. You never saw a donkey look feebler and sillier than Puzzle did as he walked up to Aslan, and he looked beside Aslan as a small kitten looks beside a St. Bernard. The lion bowed down with his head and whispered something to Puzzle, at which his long ears went down. But then he said something else, at which the ears perked up again. The humans couldn't hear what he had said either time. Then Aslan turned to them and said, "You do not yet look so happy as I mean you to be." Lucy said, "We're so afraid of being sent away, Aslan, and you have sent us back into our own world so often." "No fear of that," said Aslan. "Have you not guessed?" Their hearts leaped, and a wild hope rose within them. "There was a real railway accident," said Aslan softly. "Your father and mother and all of you are, as you used to call it in the Shadowlands, dead. The term is over. The holidays have begun. The dream is ended. This is the morning." And as he spoke, he no longer looked to them like a lion. But the things that began to happen after that were so great and beautiful that I cannot write them. And for us, this is the end of all the stories. And we can most truly say that they all lived happily ever after. But for them, it was only the beginning of the real story. And all their life in this world and all their adventures in Narnia had only been the cover and the title page. Now at last they were beginning chapter 1 of the great story, which no one on earth has read, which goes on forever and ever, in which every chapter is better than the one before. If I don't see you before, I'll see you when we get there.